We jump into Torah Tasavav and Likutei Moharan from Rabbi Nachman's zechus Yagan Aleinu. We began opening up the sugya yesterday, speaking about fear, speaking about pachad, anxiety, yira, and we spoke about the connection between yira and malchus. Rabbi Nachman quoted a pasuk, Eretz yara v'shakata, Eretz yara. Eretz is always malchus. That's our lived experience of reality, is connected to yira. And we explained that this whole world is composed of borders and boundaries and demarcations and personal limitations, the experience of reality from our own fragmented standpoint. And everything in the world is like that in order for things to maintain an identity of their own. And we said that fear viscerally comes from a place of wanting to live, of being afraid for this experience to end. And Rabbi Nachman kept on using the word atzmai, used it a number of times. The yadin ba'atzmai. Sha'adam efached is atzmai. The whole focus is on oneself, right? And that's what yira really brings about, because yira is a result of din. Yira is a result of limitation as opposed to chesed. And limitation demarcates a person's own personal experience, and that's the bechina, that's the aspect of atzmai, which we keep on saying. And the Rebbe says if a person wants to be saved from pachad, from fear, then a person needs to be living a life of mishpat. Because im yesh din lamata, then ein din lamala. And then a person is able to rectify this experience of a visceral desire to live, where in truth, a person is living in alignment with that reality of them living in this demarcated space. Good morning, thanks for joining us. Right, to live in a demarcated space where they are validating the value and the determinacy of this life, of having been placed here, by aligning themselves with a vision, by aligning themselves with an objective, with a goal, and trying as best as they can to stay on top of their dealings. Kol hasakav, Rabbi Nachman says, when a person is looking and watching and mashkiach, watching over their thoughts and their words and their actions, trying to live in alignment with some kind of framework and structure for growth. In so doing, then that sweetens the pachad, because then a person is able to say to oneself that ultimately, if I'm living in alignment with higher values, then I recognize that this experience of mine as an independent entity here is not the real reality. It's just here, like I'm here on a mission. I'm here as part of a much broader reality, that if we're living in alignment with that, so then the pachad is much less, because I recognize that this is not all there is. And I'm not afraid of having to go to the other realm, of meeting what else there is out there, because I'm okay with that realm. I'm living in alignment with that realm. And that takes a realistic perspective and expectations that are aligned with the realities of being human, right? That's very important, that a person doesn't set their cheshbon nefesh expectations on an unrealistic spectrum, right, of some angelic vision of what they think they should be or they could be if they can't be, right? Cheshbon nefesh doesn't mean that I hold myself up against Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Cheshbon nefesh means, am I taking the next right step for me in my circumstances? Am I a person who's grappling within my own framework? We've spoken about that prior, right, with regard to Shmir Sabris. We spoke about how that journey is adjusted for each person, where they're at. And different people, like Rav Dessler makes this point incredibly clear. I believe maybe he was influenced by Rabbi Nachman and Torah Kuf Nun Vav, which we'll see. Every person has their own nekudas habechira, right? Every person is going to have their own point of choice. And for some people, their free choice enables them to withhold from certain behaviors. Other people, their free choice enables them to seek help because they can't withhold from certain behaviors, right? And that means that life is a spectrum. But all the while that a person is living within some framework of cheshbon, they're mechushban. It's not a free-for-all. And I believe that, the overwhelming majority of Orthodox Jews, of Torah Yidden, are within that category, right? We're people who live with cheshbon, sometimes more of the time, sometimes less of the time, more intensely, sometimes less intensely. But ultimately, generally speaking, we are people who are living with a perspective. Good morning, Rucham Abai. Thanks for joining. We're people who live with a consciousness of growth. We're people who are living with that consciousness. And to the extent that a person recognizes that these two things are linked, cheshbon nefesh and yira pachad, so then like Rabbi Nachman says, melech, which is malchus, b'mishpat yamid aretz. If we want to elevate our own experience of yira, which is connected to aretz, melech b'mishpat yamid aretz, and then a person is privileged to experience the other pasuk in Tehillim v'sam derech, that when a person places their pathways, but Chazal darshan that some should be read as the word sham, which means to evaluate. So sham derech, when a person is evaluating the paths on which they're walking in this lifetime, then are'enu, the pasuk continues, b'yesha elokim. Yesha elokim means that a person will be saved from elokim. What's elokim is midas adin, and a person will only bask in the experience of yudke vavke, because we won't need, right, and that's all we learned yesterday, just to review very quickly, we won't need to have the experience of mishpat surrounding us, which is rooted in the pasuk lmishpatecha amdu hakol avadecha, where literally everything becomes a shliach from a Kadosh Baruch Hu to shake us awake, like we said yesterday with the alarm clock. We're already awake, and we don't need that reminder. Okay, that was just a quick review of yesterday. Let's jump in to Eis Gimel, where the Rebbe says a very, very deep thing. And the Heilige Tzaddik says, V'shayrish hayira hu das. The Rebbe says that the essence of yira, of fear, hu das, is rooted in the spiritual capacity of das, of consciousness. K'moishe kasav Eitz Chaim, as it's written in the Eitz Chaim of the R Yaakov, Shemansepach, these 5 letters, Mem, Nun, Sadi, Pei, Chaf, are linked together in this word Mansepach, that's how generally you pronounce it, Mansepach, because all of them are the closing letters. They are called the Kfulos, right? These are letters that have a different form than the other form, right, of the mem, right? So there's a mem pshuta, and there's a mem sofit, or an endamem, or a closing mem, or a final mem, many different words for it in different parts of the community. But the mem has a mem that is kafuf, and a mem pashat, a nun, kafuf pashat, a tzadi, a pei, a chaf. All of these have a different form where they are closing letters. And the Mekubalim explain that the difference between the open letters, the iteration of which can be found at any point in the word, right, the first letter of the word or a middle of the word, and the letters that can only be found at the end of a word, like an endamem, right, closing mem, you understand, right, all the different letters, right, the nun pshuta and the pei and the chaf and the tzadi, is that letters that are at the beginning or the middle of a word are connected to the realm of chesed because they represent an energy of flow. Right? If they're at the beginning of a word, it's open. They're just opening the word is going to continue after them. If they're in the middle, they're like a portal. They're there to contribute to the flow of information from one letter to the next. It's like an open door. Mansepach, these 5 letters are called letters of din, because they are coming to stop the word. Right there at the end of a word, they bookend the word, and no information is continuing past them. These 5 letters, Mem, Nun, Tzadi, Pei, Chaf, are referred to in the Mekubalim as the Chamesh Gevurais. The 5 Gevurais. They're called Gevurais, and they're associated with the 5 fingers on the left hand. Mansepach. These are the 5 closing letters. The left hand is generally associated with Gevura. Gevura is Droya Smala, is the left hand, as the Pasach Elio tells us. And Das, as we know, just speaking a little bit, giving a little bit of the background for this, a huge idea, but just for what's necessary here, Das is a combination of Chachma and Bina, as we know, right? Chachma, Bina, and Das. Chachma, if you have your spheres chart in front of you, you can think in your head, right? Chachma is on the right-hand side. Chachma is the emergence of the right hand, because above Chachma is just Keser, and Keser is in the middle. And when we talk about Das, right, we leave Keser out altogether because there can only be 10 spheres. So right now I'm leaving out Keser, but Chachma, Reishis Chachma, like we learned in Torah Aleph, in the aspect in which Chachma is the first emergence of anything. Right, so Chachma begins on the right hand side. And Chachma contributes the Chamesh Chasadim, that's going to be the 5 fingers on the right hand. Bina is the earliest emergence of the left hand side. Now Bina is total Rachamim. Bina is still a place of the moichin. Bina and chachma are in what's called zivuga b'tidira, that they have a constant connection. Train Ray and Dilemma Sparshin, they're two friends that don't ever disconnect, like the two hemispheres of the brain that work inextricably one with the other. That's chachma and bina. But in a certain aspect, bina is providing the vessel for the energy of chachma, and in that sense, there's something almost feminine, but there's something din-oriented about it, vessel-oriented. And ultimately, of course, bina is going to become the aim habanim, right? It's going to become the mother, so to speak, from which all the 7 midos are born out of bina. So it's not like a letter that comes at the end of a word. It's not din. What the Zohar Kadosh tells us, and the Shari explains at length, is that bina mina dinin misarin. Bina is the place where the earliest root of din is awakened within bina. Ultimately, it's a place of total chachma, and that's why we can say kol mada avid rachmana is, of course, letav avid. Everything is good, but in bina you find the earliest root, and you find the shoresh of gevura, because it is the earliest emergence of the left-hand side, right, of the side of the left. If you don't mind passing a quick run right over there on the shop. Thanks for joining us. That's the emergence of the left-hand side. When chachma and bina come together to produce consciousness, which we call das, they each contribute their element, right? So das has within it chasadim and gevuras. Das receives the earliest root and the primordial, fundamental foundation of chesed, right? Of the right side from chachma. That's the chamesh chasadim. And it receives from the left-hand side, from bina, the chamesh gevuras in the form of the 5 letters of mansepach. And those come down into das. So let's go back and say, Sharish hayirahu das. The essence of yira comes from that place of das, of consciousness. Mansepach, these 5 letters, mem, nun, sadi, pei, chaf, the closing letters, the chamesh gevuras, are rooted in the sphere of das, that is within the partsuf, that is within the divine energetic persona of Zeir Ampin, the small face, which is generally associated with the lower 7 or the lower 6, right? 6 out of the lower 7 spheros that come together in a persona. But Zeir Ampin also has 10 spheres within itself, right? Because it becomes something else. It's the conjugation of the 6 spheros from Chesed down to Yesod, but it has its own 10 spheros, and it has the sphere of Das within it. Ultimately, it's the seat of our consciousness. It's me and you. It's the way that we experience life. We have the bechina of das within us. That's the conjugation of the chachma and the bina, the chamesh chasadim and the chamesh gevuras, the mansepach. Yira, more specifically, is rooted in the aspect of bina, which again, if you're thinking of chachma and bina as the energies of either total oceanic chesed, no boundaries, nachla bli mitzarim, and bina is the earliest form of boundaries, this would make sense, because we said, again, that yira is very self-oriented. It's rooted in a person's sense of self and the desire for the maintenance of a person's sense of self, whether that's with regard to self-preservation in a life or death scenario, or whether that's related to the inability to feel pain, or the unwillingness, let's say, to feel pain, right? Which is also very self-oriented. I don't want to feel pain. I'm afraid to get hurt, right? I'm afraid of violence. I'm afraid, because that's a self-oriented consciousness. Says Rabbi Nachman, that is rooted in bina, which is manifest in our general das, because bina is the place of limitation. Bina is the place of vessels. Bina is the place of demarcation. In Chachma, I recognize I'm just a part of the divine. I don't have any feelings per se from a self-oriented perspective. Kol mada avrachmana letavavid, and a person can live that way, and maybe the great tzaddikim didn't feel any pain, and Rabbi Akiva yatsa nishmas be'echad. That's the aspect of the echad of Chachma. But the bina means that I exist, and that's where yira is. And in that place, like we learned yesterday, if a person sweetens that experience of self, not from a terror or a fear of things that might happen to them, But by recognizing that life matters and taking life seriously enough to try to be on top of the game, to make sure that we're developing, that we're meeting goals and making, like meeting deadlines, not in this like, oh my gosh, all the stuff I have to do, and like someone said, a cheshbon nefesh, right, could cause people to be so adarab, so anxious. Usually, not in that way, but in a way of feeling empowered, in a way of recognizing I matter, life matters. I don't have to be perfect, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu trusts me to stand up in this world and to make a mensch out of myself, and it might take many, many long decades, but it's something that I'm working on, right? That kind of thing, then a person's able to sweeten their sense of self, which they were given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that they would do this work, so that they would take responsibility for their little facet or fragment of Knesset Yisrael, of the collective soul of the Jewish nation, and do what they can to develop that bit by bit by bit by bit. Is this clear so far? Is this a little bit of a difficult line? Yeah? You understand? Yira is rooted in mansapach of das of zer ampin. Okay, this is a little bit what it means. How does Rabbi Nachman know this? How does the R Yaakov know this? Kamashakasav az tavin yiras Hashem. Then a person will understand yiras shamayim, yiras Hashem, v'das elokim timtza. And you will find das elokim. And the conjugation between the words yiras Hashem and das elokim is exactly this. Elokim is the aspect of mansapach. Das is where mansapach is rooted. Or the opposite, right? Mansapach is where das is rooted, and Yiras Hashem is connected to this. That's where Yira comes from. Yira is rooted in das of Mansapach. Of course, Elokim also has 5 letters, and that's also, in a different sense, right, the 5 letters of Mansapach, even though it's obviously different letters, right? But it's all connected to the 5 fingers on the left hand, which is generally associated with chabura. Then Rabbi Nachman tells us, Ve'ikra das ubalev. The primary aspect of das is in the heart. This that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has not given you a heart to understand. Leiv ladas. Das is rooted in the leiv. What do we know about the leiv? It's the same idea. Right? What sphera is the leiv generally associated with? Bina. Bina is called liba. Bina is the leiv, even though Bina is up here and the leiv is down here. But in a certain sense, there's a certain wisdom. There's a binas halev. Ubelavava yavin v'shav v'sein b'libeinu bina. Right, at least in the Sefar we say v'sein b'libeinu bina. Right, Bina is connected to the leiv. It's the same idea. Das is rooted in the leiv, in Bina, in this experience of self. That's really what it comes down to. It's the experience of selfhood. That's where Yira comes from, to preserve the self. Atzmai. Gam sham ikra Yira. And so the Yira is also going to be associated with the leiv. Like the Gemara tells us, Davar HaMasr L'Leiv Namar By V'Yiresem Adikacha. We already had this Maimar Chazal previously. That's something that is associated with the leiv. So that's where Yiras Shamayim is relevant. Like we said, the Adam Yiras Shamayim, Begalei, but also B'Seiser. And that's that aspect of Davar HaMasr L'Leiv, something that's only given over to a person's own heart. Never by V'Yiresem Alekecha. But in a deeper, more Kabbalistic sense, Yira is rooted in the Leiv, because the spiritual root of the heart is Bina. And Bina is the place of din. Bina is the place of limitation. Bina is the place of fragmentation, the experience of self, as opposed to being melted into the infinity of godliness, which we're going to get to, Be'ezus Hashem. But first, a person has to stay rooted, grounded in their sense of self. The sense of self, just to reiterate again, can give rise to pachad, yira, to want to self-preserve, or it can give rise to a person's, trying to protect oneself, and a person that's threatened feels yira, or the sense of self can be mitigated, can be sweetened by a person taking life seriously enough to live with cheshbon hanefesh kishiyesh din lamata. Then that sweetens the din lamala, right? And that's what we're trying to get at. Where's that rooted? Mansapach of das dezer anpin and bina liba. Hainu sheyeda mimi yisiyare. Hainu liras Hashem hanichbad yiras haroimamas. That's what bina enables us to recognize. That if I'm feeling fear, that experience is intended to be elevated, to the essence of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me fear in the first place, which again, just to clarify, is rooted in my sense of self, which means why I have a sense of self in the first place, which means to take my life seriously, which means to do something with my life to the extent that I possibly can. And that's going to sweeten, that's called elevating the din l'sharsha. Because din, as it gets channeled through the system of the spheres until it comes down to malchus, right, which is a place of regleha yardas maves. Malchus, we learned in Torah Aleph, can be seen as a malchus, the sitra achra. It can be seen as totally disconnected from Hashem. That means that yira, which comes down into malchus, because we already learned eretz yara v'shakata, right, that eretz, which is malchus, and yira are associated one with the other. When yira comes down to that level, it becomes totally detached from elevation, from spiritual connection, it becomes something very, very lowly. It becomes something very spiritually precarious. When a person lives in anxiety, it means it's the opposite of emunah, right? A person is living in this state of fear and agitation, and I don't know what's going to be, and that's what happens when yira comes down to eretz. How do you elevate yira? Because yira is not a bad midah. There are no bad midahs other than atzvos. Atzvos is the only bad midah objectively. It's connected to the amalek. It's the amalek of emotions, right? Depression. It's the only giving up. That's the only thing that we have to eradicate completely. Everything else is fair play for elevation, right? It comes from the klipas noga. In Tanya terminology, it comes from a place that can be elevated. Yira is no exception to the rule. Ava is certainly that case, right? We know that anytime that a person feels attraction to something, a meshicha to something, we're supposed to elevate that for Kedusha. And that's a huge job, and it can take a lifetime to do that. But ultimately, we speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in terminology of attraction. When we tell HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in one of the most powerful psukim, maybe in the whole Tanakh, Mashcheni acharecha narutza. We should, what does it mean to be mashuch, to be pulled, to be addicted, to be mashcheni acharecha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, help that I should be drawn after you, narutza. I'm going to run after you my whole life to be a mavakesh Hashem. Yira is no exception to this rule. Ava can be elevated, yira can be elevated. So how do we elevate yira? Says the Rebbe over here, is mapping it out for us metaphysically. Well, you have to know where it is rooted. And the Rebbe he's using Kabbalistic terminology, but he's trying to get it. It's a very deep psychological journey, and a very, the word psychological has the word logical in it. It's a logical journey. It's a psychological journey. And the Rebbe is taking us, sort of popping the hood on our own psyche, and he's enabling us and availing us the information necessary for us to understand how to get out of this experience. So the Rebbe says Yira is eretz. That's when it's disconnected from its root, and that when it becomes an obsession with a sense of self and the frenetic or urgent desire to self-preserve. And that's why a person lives in a state of yira, because who knows what's going to be, because this world is all there is, and and that's where a person's stuck in that experience of anxiety. That's eretz. So go back to the beginning. Rabbi Nachman says tzarich lahalois midas hayira eretz l'sharsha. Now Rabbi Nachman is telling us about the shoresh. Where is the shoresh of yira? Because yira was all associated with my own sense of self. Why do I have a sense of self? Well, where was this sense of self created? It was created when Bina emerged from Chachma. It was created when there was the earliest expression of something other, so to speak, than the oceanic oneness of God, where Bina emerges, and that gives rise to this illusory, but very real for us, very real, because it's all there is, for our sense of self. Why does a person have a sense of self? Because I'm on a mission in this world. And then afterwards we go back up and we see ourselves for what we really are, which is part and parcel of something so much bigger, so much deeper. But if I have a sense of self and I perceive this world to be meaningful, then how am I living? That's the cheshbon. Literally, that's the cheshbon. And when a person makes that cheshbon hanefesh, Rabbi Nachman says, Melech b'mishpati yamid eretz. You elevated Malchus to its root in Bina. Where a person looks with das, with consciousness objectively at what they're experiencing, and they watch it almost with like a detached sense of observation. They observe it. We spoke yesterday briefly about Rabbi Nachman's conception of us riding our thoughts, right? Like a rider rides a horse and being able to guide them. It begins with detachment. Havdalah. A person separates themselves from it, or they're able to look at it. And if a person is privy to the map of the self, then they have the tools to be able to figure this out. Like, what am I experiencing? What is this? Where is this rooted? Bring it down to the philosophical underpinning, right? What is yira? Why am I feeling what I'm feeling? Can I feel this in a holy sense? Can I channel this yira that instead of it being this lowly fear that's all like sort of self-oriented, can I turn those arrows around so I still feel the same feeling, but they're other-oriented? And in that sense, I can feel Yira Shamayim, which again doesn't mean that I'm afraid of God, but it means that I recognize that my sense of self is here for the purpose of performing a service on behalf of God, and to the extent that I'm distant from doing what I was sent to this world to do, well, that's a scary thing. And to the extent that I'm aligning myself to the best of my capacity, each person in their own way, along the journey where they are, then I have nothing to fear. Rabbi Nachman says not to be afraid at all, even though the world is a very narrow bridge. What's the aspect of the narrow bridge? This is Bina. Bina is the narrow bridge. What's narrow? Because it's limited. Chachma is not narrow. Chachma has no boundaries. It's not a meitzar. Bina is that place of the whole wide world is a very narrow bridge. Is a gesher tzar ma'od. But the Rebbe says, but the main thing is not to be afraid at all. How can I be not afraid at all? Because the Rebbe says, if I shift into a higher state of consciousness, if I elevate Eretz, Melech b'mishpat Yamid Eretz, and I bring Eretz, which is the final Hey of Yud Kei Vav Kei, back to its root in Bina, which is the first Hey of Yud Kei Vav Kei, then we're operating on a higher level, and we're using our emotions properly. And we're aligned. Hainu sheyeda mimi yisyari. And to live in a state of yiras haroimim. I'm not afraid of anything that's going to happen to me in this world, but a person's conscious of a much larger reality. And a person endeavors to live in alignment with their responsibility vis-a-vis that reality. Yiras haroimim.
Does he say explicitly that the shorish is in Bina?
Yeah, well, he's not using the word Bina, but that's what he's saying, right?
Which words do you see that?
Mansapach in Das is the energy that's contributed by Bina, and Leiv is a code word for Bina. Okay, so those two things tell us that it's Bina.
Thank you.
Says the Heilige Rebbe Schus Yargen Aleinu Anais Dalu Kishmagia LeBechinas Das Zoichalas Sagas HaTorah. So then, usually what happens is when a person starts to think in this way, whether they know the Kabbalah of it, or whether they just, get woken up in their life, whether they have a wake-up call, or they start to do some hisponinus in themselves, what did we say yesterday? It all comes down to time. What's the mitzvah that's associated most with time, even though there's tons of time-bound mitzvahs? What's the mitzvah that we're supposed to fill our time with? V'yigisa b'yayim v'layla, right? At least according to one interpretation, is to learn Torah. That's the first thing. That's the first thing. Torah is the doorway that opens up to everything else. To the degree that a person is connected to Limanat Torah. That's the first thing. So the Rebbe says that's what's going to happen. When a person rises in consciousness, they start to look at their life, which is their time, like I said yesterday, and they start to ask themselves, how am I living? How am I living? What am I using my time for? Then they come to learn Torah. The pasuk in Mishlei says, Shlomo Melech says, I am wisdom, shachanti arma, has dwelled with me arma, which is like a form, a certain kind of, sort of like street smart, like a little bit, what's a good word for it, like a nachash aram, sly, cunning, exactly, something like that. Shachanti arma. Sheshchunas hatayra eitzel bardas. The pasuk is telling us, Ani chachma shechanti arma. Chachma resides with someone who is aram, somebody who is already contemplating. The pasuk says in Daniel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives chachma to those who are already wise. Like the other pasuk says, Tein l'chacham yechkam oid. And if you give wisdom to someone who is already wise, they're going to grow and grow and grow. So step one is a person has to rise in consciousness. If we're giving Torah to people who are not living out of a state of consciousness, it's ultimately, we've spoken about this in the past, it can become a samaves. It doesn't have a vessel. Like the Vilna Gaon says, you plant the most beautiful, perfect seed, but it's in earth that doesn't have any nutrients, it's going to rot, and it's not the fault of the seed. The seed is fine. But the earth has to be ready. Everything that we're doing now in this time period between Pesach and Shavuos, which according to the Zohar, really according to the Arizal, is just Cholamoid Pesach in a certain sense, or Cholamoid. That's why Shavuos is called Atzeres. It's like a Shmini Atzeres of Pesach. This whole extended period now is not stam, like okay, Pesach's over, and now we're getting ready for Shavuos. It's we're in a process now. Bechlal, throughout the Jewish year, it's all one process, and whatever day you find, we'll fit it into the process of the months and the process of the different Yom Tovim and their interactions. But Pesach and Shavuos is particularly visceral, right? We're now in that intermediate time between Pesach and Shavuos. Shavuos is Kabbalas HaTorah, and like the pasuk says, Lishmar Derech Eitz Chaim. That's the root where Chazal learn in the Medrash. That derech eretz kadma l'Torah, because Eitz Chaim is of course the Torah. Eitz Chaim milam achazikama, and the pasuk says lishmar derech Eitz Chaim. So derech comes before the Eitz Chaim. Derech is derech eretz. Derech eretz, the way that we're learning that over here, eretz is malchus, and derech is asam derech, our enabiyesh alikim. Derech eretz. When a person is some derech, sham derech, when they evaluate their path as it relates to eretz, which is their anxiety and their fear. And a person starts to reflect on their life. That's exactly what we're doing now in this period of time of derech eretz, which is svira kadma l'Torah, building up our vessels to enable us to access the Torah Kedusha.
And also Malchus of Malchus, right?
B'diuk.
Eretz Mamish.
Eretz of Eretz. Yeah. Beautiful. The tikkun of anxiety. Beautiful. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Yahiv Chachmas al Chakimin. And so we, in this period of time, need to be making sure that our earth, which is going to be Mekapel, the seed of the Torah Kedusha, Kula Zera Emes, right, like we learned in one of the earlier Torahs, Torah tests. Our job is to make sure that earth is full of nutrients, which means to come, and very, very, very simply, to self-awareness. To try as best as we can in this period of time to be self-aware, which means to reflect on our lives, to be people who are, that's what it means, to be, again, mechushban, to be a person who is not doing cheshbon hanefesh like in an intense way, but who lives life of cheshbon hanefesh, which according to Rav Kluger means simply to make a very simple calculation. Cheshbon, to make a calculation, that's a one-word calculation, nefesh, I'm a soul. That's what cheshbon hanefesh means. Doesn't mean to beat yourself up and I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that. It's very simple. To live life with only one cheshbon. I am a nefesh. Okay. Now, in relation to my being a nefesh in this world, I have to then take a look at my life. How am I living? Am I living in this soul-oriented way? How am I spending my time? That's the first thing. It goes to time. How am I spending my time? Do I have more time? One of the Yiddim was saying yesterday, that someone sent him a podcast. Says, when am I going to find time to listen to it? And then before he knew it, how long is an hour and a half, 2-hour podcast? He found the time to listen to it. 5 minutes here, and it's a reflection. You look back at your day. It's like, wow, I did have 2 hours. If I want, so that's an incredible thing. So a person can think in their own minds. And again, every person's going to have their own obstacles to this. Everything is easier said than done. Everything is easier written than done. Everything is easier read than done. Everything is easier taught than done. But there are strategies that a person is able to employ. A person will set up chavrusas for themselves. A person accountability. A person goes online. It's a very simple thing, and they start to look for different programs, different things that they'll know for themselves. They can get excited about. There are millions of learning programs today. Mishnah Berurah Yomi, Rambam Yomi, Amud Yomi, Daf Yomi, whether it's Gemara, whether it's Halakha. Today, anything, well, that we're already doing, that's what we don't need to say. But everything else, whatever you want to learn is accessible today. But it has to be rooted in a place of a cheshbon of nefesh. Then a person comes to Shavuos, and the seed of the Torah comes down into fertile ground with nutrients that can foster this seed. Otherwise, we're not Yahiv Chachma l'Chakimin. We're giving Chachma, but there's no Chakimin. There's no groundwork. And then what happens is that a person is able to sit and learn, but the Torah doesn't connect. It doesn't go in. It doesn't really go in, and so it cannot last. And chas v'shalom, the seed will rot.
the 50th day is also Shar Nun Bina as well.
Absolutely.
Which Rabbi Nachman says, V'ashuva aleichem, which is Shuvah, V'hashevoisa al levavecha. So that day.
Beautiful,
goes to the land.
beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. You go from Malchus Shabbat Malchus into Bina.
That which is Eretz Teva Mamish.
Stunning. Stunning. I'm writing something about that now. As Hashem, I'll try to incorporate it. Beautiful. Says the Rebbe's Chus Yagnaleno al Yeshnei Bechinas Torah, but there are two aspects of the Torah. Yesh Bechinas Nigle or Bechinas Nister. There's two things in Torah. There's Nigle and there's Nister. Aval Bechinas Nister ein Zechus el Asid Lavai. The aspect of the Nister of Torah is only going to be fully revealed La'asid Lavai. We've spoken about this in previous lessons, where it's the aspect of what's called the Torah Da'atika Stima, the ancient hidden Torah, that's going to be revealed by Mashiach La'asid Lavai. Listen to this carefully, Chaver. In this world, the way to be able to begin to taste of that energy of La'asid Lavai, of the Torah of Nister, which, as it connotes, is completely transcendent of this world, and that's why we can't fully access it in this world, and it can only be accessed when everything so completely transforms that everything's going to be different. So the connotation is that it is a Torah of a limitlessness. It's not a Torah that relates to boundaries and distinctions and hair splitting. It's a Torah of the Zohar HaKadosh, which is littered with the expression, as I've said earlier in previous year, ta chazi, come and see. It's related to sight, to the eyes, which are chachma, which take in the whole picture, all the different details, and sees the whole thing as one. But in Shas, Bavli, it's Tashma. Tashma is Bina orientation. Details, parameters. I always say, in Hilchos Shabbos with ketchup, is it a liquid or a solid? Like, no other group of humans has had debates over whether ketchup is a liquid or a solid. It's unbelievable. Meaning us Jews that don't care for this world a bit, that our whole focus is on transcendence. Because of that, like I said yesterday, the ones who take it the most seriously know it's a joke, and the ones who take, because of that, we know the most. We mamish get down to, we have to define everything. We have to define every parameter. Halacha requires us to know what this world is. That's Bina, Tashma, where a person can only hear one thing at a time. A person can only hear one thing at a time, as opposed to Chachma, which takes in the all. So the whole Zohar HaKadosh, which is a little bit of a glimmer of a taste of the Torah that's going to be revealed by Asid Lavai, which is the direction that we're moving, is a Torah of Chachma, of limitlessness. And the Torah of Galus, which is a Torah of Olam Hazeh, is the Torah of Tashma, is the Torah of hair-splitting dialectic, is the Torah of Maven Davar Mitoich Davar, to know what one Davar is and what another Davar is, because it's the energy of Bina, which is the earliest root of separateness and individuality and independence. It's a Torah that reinforces self. But the Rebbe says, if you want to be able to taste a little bit of the energy of Chachma, a little bit of the energy of Geula, of redemption, of La'asid Lavai, says the Rebbe, Tefillah b'mesiras nefesh. What was Cheshbon HaNefesh? Cheshbon HaNefesh was to calculate one's life as a result of their awareness of themselves as a nefesh. What is Mesiras Nefesh? Where a person is able to let go of their sense of self. So what does it mean, Tefillah b'mesiras nefesh? Doesn't mean that a person has to risk their life to daven. That's not what Rabbi Nachman says. As we're going to see, Tefillah b'mesiras nefesh, we're going to see at the end of the paragraph, but I'll just speak it out now. Tefillah b'mesiras nefesh means that a person does not daven for themselves. They daven for much bigger things. Their whole tefillah is focused on the other. Whether they're davening for other people, whether they're davening for Klal Yisrael, whether their whole tefillah is Ribbon Shalom, I want to get close to you for you. I don't need anything for me. I want to do my mission in this world. Not for me, but so that I can find my place within the whole collective spirit of Knesset Yisrael. This energy, this Geula-oriented energy of collectivity, of unity and oneness, which begins with Klal Yisrael, and that will extend to the whole humanity, and then will extend to all of creation, like Rav Kook teaches in the Fourfold Song. Very, very important paragraph, or a collection of paragraphs, a piece, a writing from Rav Kook, which will remind me, I'll send it to the chat after. With our 4 songs, there's the song of the individual, there's the song of the nation, there's the song of humanity, and there's the song of all of existence. Most people never make it past the first song. We're not even informed that there are other songs. And the Torah that we're learning predominantly is a Torah that reinforces self, that reinforces fragmentation. And we need that. Again, I'm not saying, it's a terrible thing. It's the most wonderful thing. We need to do that avodah. Like I've mentioned previously in the other Torahs, it's an avodah to learn Talmud Bavli. Remember? It's an avodah, meaning it's a Kabbalistic practice. I know it sounds crazy. It's like we're talking about Nikla. Nikla in and of itself is part and parcel of what's necessary, all the while the Mashiach hasn't yet come to work through the Sfeikus, remember, and to come to clarity. We learn. It's incredibly important to do that every day. It's crucial. However, when that's all there is, and we're not tasting concepts that are coming from the realm of Pnimius, coming from Nister, what that can lead to is a hyper focus on oneself, even in spiritual terms, where it becomes about my olam haba, and therefore I can push you over so that I can give my kvittel to the Rebbe, and it becomes etc., 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 and this is not what it's supposed to be. We move past the song of the self, and we enter into the song of the nation. Be'ez Hashem, in the next Torah, we're going to learn about the song of humanity, which we've already alluded to. Rabbi Nachman speaks about perhaps more than anybody else of that generation. You don't find any of the other, Hasidic Rebbes of that dar speaking about that, and maybe into the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you don't find almost anybody else outside of Rav Kook and a few others, who really had that vision. And this is what Klal Yisrael are yearning for now, is to taste from that hasaga, from that ha'ara that's coming from beyond. This is what we're after. Says Rabbi Nachman, how do you get it? Tefillah b'mesiras nefesh. Well, tefillah, says the Rebbe, is an unbelievable thing. Kehal Yedidim. But how do you get to that aspect of nister, right, which is tefillah b'mesiras nefesh, which is letting go of my sense of self so I can connect to that realm beyond? Paradoxically, it comes through nigla, because you first have to have a self to give away. Unbelievable. You first have to have a sense of identity. And I'm thinking maybe with the Chaver, I'll just tell you, for those who are here locally, Be'ez Hashem, Shavuos night, we're going to be doing a whole night learning. So it's 2.5 hours straight, chabura. We're going to learn a sugya b'nigla and nister, something similar to what we did by the Shabbos HaGadol Drasha. I haven't picked the exact sugya yet. There's something I have my eye on, but I have to see. And if I choose that one, it'll all be on this topic, as you're going to see. And the sugya of tzitzis and shatnas and tzitzis, we'll see. I'm not super sure yet, but ultimately, stay tuned for that. But the vessel comes first. The rootedness in this reality comes first. Once a person has a sense of self, which is Torah shebenigla, that's a result of das, that's a result of cheshbon hanefesh, then a person can come to tefillah. We'll just go a couple minutes more, we'll finish the paragraph. Torah of nigla is the aspect of Sinai, which is better, a Sinai or Oikar Harim. What Sinai is a humble mountain, right? But it's like a pile, and that's the aspect of a person who's a big bucky, who knows a lot of different yedias, a lot of different information from across a very wide spectrum of text and information. Oikar Harim is a person who can uproot mountains, a person who's incredibly deep. Which one is more important? Haimanayo Adif, Veheshivu, and they answer Sinai Adif. It's more important to have a lot of information, even if a person isn't incredibly deep. Rabbi Yosef, I'm sure, was a huge amkin also, but he was known for his bikiyas. He had a kol tarakula on his fingertips. He was a Sinai at everything. Rav Chaim Kanievsky is a Sinai. It's not, it's not Rav Chaim Brisker, but he knows kol tarakula on his fingertips. The Marechitaya. Everybody needs the Marechitaya, a person who has access to all the information. So everybody needs the Torah of Nigla, because the Torah of Nigla is associated with Harim, with a Sinai, which is the aspect of information. Aikar Harim is depth. That's the aspect of Nister. That's to go beyond the surface. And therefore, Rabbi Nachman is understanding that Sinai is a reference to the Torah of Nigla, and Oiker Harim, from the standpoint of it referring to someone who goes beyond the surface, Oiker Harim, they go underneath the mountain, is the aspect of Nister. And the Gemara is saying, what's more valuable in this world, right? Nigla or Nister? And the Torah says, well, Nigla, because on this worldly level, especially throughout Galus, Nigla was what we needed, because that was our reality. We didn't have hasagas of something beyond. It wasn't a kin or a line or matim to the Hebrew word to our reality. Today things are different, right? And that's the mediation of like how different are they? Coming out to Yom Ha'atzmaut, this whole conversation of like what Rav Kook felt about what Zionism was. He didn't make any comment on the state of Israel. Most people don't know this because the state of Israel was founded long after Rav Kook had died. So it's not so clear that there's a direct link between what Rav Kook saw and what actually evolved. But without getting into that now, the point is that the whole fundamental conversation thereby, especially with regard to the return to our homeland, the process is unfolding, but how far along are we? Is this still Gullus like Poland 1334? Or are we on the cusp of Geula and there are tzaddikim across the spectrum? And every person is going to follow their own netiyah and what their own lave is telling them. But ultimately we stand now, at least from my perspective and the way that I personally see things, and invite other people to consider whether that resonates with their heart, and then they can take or leave everything I say all the time, just sharing my own ruminations. The way that I see it is that we are mamish at the end. We're mamish at the end. And so here, we're starting to move into Aikar Harim. It's unbelievable because today ChatGPT is Sinai. You already have access to Kol Tarakula. And it's only going to get better and 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 way better. And then better in ways that we can't even imagine, where you can just have it implanted into your brain. That's going to be an interesting hashkafic debate, But that's where we're headed. People don't realize that. So then all that's going to be left is Aikar Harim. All that's going to be left is creativity, emotional depth, authenticity, vulnerability, sincerity. It won't be about information anymore. As some of the chaver we're having a conversation about this on the discussion chat, on the men's chat. It won't be about that anymore. Sinai will be there. You understand? Because Sinai is the Bechina of Tarsha Benigla, which is Galus. As we get closer and closer to Geula, we have access to all the information. Now what becomes valuable is the Aikar Harim, a person who's able to go beyond the mountain, under the surface, and find the connections, and find the links, and find the new, which is what Likutei Moharan is. Make no mistake, that this whole sefer is that. Rabbi Nachman is Kol Tarakula, and going beyond the surface to reveal the links, the connections, the chachma that shines within Bina.
The shorashim, the roots underneath.
That's right, the Aikar Harim, exactly. In the Eretz. Throughout history, and I would argue that today things are changing, throughout history, very few people needed this, consciousness. Chazal say that Sinai is connected to shiflus. And so it starts as a self-affirming experience, where a person is cheshbon ha-nefesh or av ha-nefesh, and I want that my life should be meaningful, and I don't want to leave this world, and I realize that I'm in this world for a purpose, so that drives a person into managing their time and starting to learn Torah. That's what we're saying, which is the bechina of nigla. With time, if a person is planting that Torah of nigla into fertile ground of faith, into fertile ground of derech eretz, with time that's going to lead to shiflas. Apropos, we're coming up to Shavuos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu left all the other mountains and he chose Sinai. Why did he choose Sinai? Because Sinai, listen to this, Sinai ends up being humble. Because a true Talmid Chacham, who maybe began the process, Kadesh Yiskar LaRav, like the Gemara in Tainus says, right, that a person starts Shaloi L'Shema, but eventually will come L'Shema. But it could be that it started with, oh my gosh, it's my life, and I want to take control of my life, and my Olam Haba, and what's going to be, etc. And so a person starts in that way, because Sinai is fundamentally shafal. Eventually, a person says, it's not about me at all, is it? I am only me because he wanted me to be me. I am me for him. And a person reverts to that aspect of shiflus. Here we finish. That the tefillah of a shafal, of a person who's lowly, is not despised. Leiv nishbar, when a person brings their nishbar, when a person brings their fragmented brokenness, and not the wholeness, but the eretz, and melech b'mishpat yamid eretz, starting with cheshbon hanefesh, we bring the malchus back to bina. Leiv nishbar, elikim lo yisivzeh. Al yedei tefillah shiba mesiras nefesh, which is what tefillah should be. Shemavata kol gashmius ve'ein gvul, which is even beyond what I mentioned before, which starts with a person not praying for oneself but praying for others. And the Rabbi Nachman says, no, a tefillah that gets to a place of espashtus hagashmius, when a person literally experiences moments where they don't even exist b'chlal, they're totally batal u'mavutal, they're null and void, like we learned experiences of Ratzai and Torah Dalet, where a person rises up and up and up and up and is nullified, legamri, just in dveikos, where every moment a person experiences infinity, where the place that a person is all there is. Says the Rebbe, you know what happens in that moment? Then a person can taste a glimmer of the Torah of Lasid level. Can taste what it might mean one day when none of the things that we think matter. And all of the boundaries and the obstacles and limitations and the stuckness of our reality fades away. In tefillah, in an elevated, heightened moment, especially like I like to say ne'ilah, which I imagine that in previous generations, maybe every mincha, was like our ne'ilah, and who can imagine what their ne'ilah was. But those final closing moments of Hashem hu Elokim, Shema Yisrael Einoid Milvado, or when a person's like a birchas kanav at the kota, but it was something, you understand? We've all tasted moments like that. When a person is null, says the Rebbe, that could only have begun with lowly, corrupted, distorted fear, channeled into cheshbon hanefesh, brought to libun HaTorah, that brings a person to shiflus, that brings a person to tefillah, that brings a person to letting go of the ego ligamri. And the Rebbe maps this whole process out. Then a person begins to taste lasid she'eina gevul ve'eina nespasis b'gevul, which is a Torah of beyond boundaries, which is a Torah that's revealing itself from a place that is not bound by limitation at all. How deep is this? Like what? I'm just trying. I'm trying to use words to give over. I hope it's in some way intelligible. Hashem should help us to think very deeply about this, especially it's perfect. It's mamish perfect for where we're at now. Tiferes Shabbat Tiferes is the aspect of Torah Shabbat Torah. As we prepare ourselves for Shavuos, to think about this, to put practical implementation in, especially with regard to our time, especially as it relates to Limud HaTorah. We want good ground so that when we're makabel the Torah, it can take root and it can flourish. And wishing everybody the most wonderful, remarkable day.
ואתה האב שלי שכל כך אוהב אותי, האב שלי מלך חי וקיים על כל נשימה שאני